So Jeremy, thanks a lot. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you too.
Can you tell me a little bit about your journey and
Sure.
what you've been doing over the last few years?
Yeah. I grew up in Australia, child of immigrants, which gives you a more international perspective. Was an activist from a very young age as a kid back in Australia. I was campaigning on all sorts of issues from the age of about 8. So this is kind of a long journey for me. Then, in the early days of when people were figuring out how to use the internet to mobilize people in new ways, I was lucky enough to be involved in some of the most interesting early experiments with that. So back in Australia, where I'm from, started this interesting organization called GetUp, which is basically a grassroots online political and social movement that's grown to become pretty big in Australia, so more members now than all the political parties put together. And then got together with some friends soon after that and co-founded a Vase, which sort of also grew in an extraordinary way. It was great to see how that evolved over the years.
And how many people on both of those networks?
So GetUp's got, I think it's about something in the order of 1.2 million people, which in the small country of Australia means a pretty good chunk of the adult population. And then I think a Vase at this point has something like 45 million members.
Wow.
So both those organizations grew in interesting ways, and so that's what inspired me back in 2009 to start Purpose, which really is kind of a mothership. It's a home for new kinds of movement building, right? Because I think really inspired by the ways that you can mobilize people and give people agency in such powerful ways that were not possible even 10 or 20 years ago. That certainly weren't possible when I was a kid running fax campaigns, in the early 90s, right? So the possibilities are vast, and that's been a lot of what I've done over the last 10, 15 years, is just experiment with those possibilities in different ways. And that's really what Purpose does. It launches new organizations, it supports existing social movements on issues like climate change, the refugee crisis, Syria, gun violence in the US, which is obviously a really important issue over there, around which there's a lot of heat. So we do that. It's been fascinating to see, even in the last 5 years, just how quickly the context is changing.
So I know that you've put a book together.
Yeah.
And can you tell us about the book and what made you want to do that?
Yeah. The book really came out of my work is as an activist and as a practitioner. I'm not an academic, but it became clear over 10, 15 years that there was a lot of insights here that really could be applied a lot more broadly. And I think the origin story a little bit is I would go around the world and people would always ask me, did Twitter cause the Arab Spring? And I'd say that's probably the wrong question to ask, right? People are always very focused on the impact of a specific technology or platform, but actually there's a much bigger shift that's happening beyond just the shift in technology, which is sort of the shift in people's expectations around participation, around their own role in the world. And as an activist, the other thing that you always learn is if you really want to understand what's happening, what's changing, how to make change, you have to study power, right? So that was the origin. And so a friend of mine, a guy called Henry Timms, had been doing some really interesting work in parallel in a sort of adjacent space. He'd started this initiative called Giving Tuesday, which is this sort of open source philanthropic movement that has ended up raising hundreds of millions of dollars of new funding for charities in the US mainly, but it's grown now to be a very global phenomenon. And I thought that was fascinating because the way he did it was very unusual. So mostly, he runs a big institution in the US. Mostly what would happen is they would slap their logo on that initiative and it would be their thing, to our discussion about competition between NGOs. But he decided to make it completely open source. He didn't slap anyone's logo on it. He created this idea, which is what if there was a day of giving the Tuesday after Thanksgiving and Black Friday in the US, where there's this sort of huge swell of consumption that happens, right? And everybody buys. There's this thing called Black Friday, and then there's an online sales event called Cyber Monday. And so he said, what if on Tuesday, the whole day was focused on giving back rather than buying stuff? And he did this in a brilliant way, and it really took off, and it really spread sideways. So he and I got talking, and we found that we were using very similar language to describe what was happening in the world. These big changes around just the emergence of the people who are figuring out how to harness this power of the connected crowd were the people, the organizations that were really succeeding, that are really succeeding, for better and worse, right? Because it isn't only good actors who are figuring out how to harness this power. And that led us to write an article in Harvard Business Review, which sort of laid out this idea of new power and drew this distinction between these two very different ways of exercising power in the 21st century, in the ways they were blending, colliding, clashing, combining. And then I also gave a TED talk on the same topic, and that sort of was the foundation for this book.
Wow, it sounds amazing.
It was a really interesting, it's been a great journey.
Okay, cool. And how can people get a copy of that book?
So the book is called New Power. Well, it's you use the power of the internet. You can find the book pretty much anywhere you are.
Can you tell me, before, as we finish, what's a sort of a guiding wisdom, or sort of what keeps you going? What sort of golden rule do you live by?
Yeah, I think the rule I try to live by is to not lose my idealism. I think that's really important. Like, I think I've been doing this kind of work for a long time, and I think it's easy to get jaded about how change happens, or the challenges, right, of breaking through in a world in which there's so much injustice and inequality. So for me, it's important that I stay idealistic. It's important that I have that kernel of belief that you can do really difficult stuff, and that ordinary people can make outsized change and impact. Because if I keep that kernel of idealism, I'm motivated to do the kind of work that I do and to help create some of these moments and movements.
Awesome. Jeremy, it's great to talk to you, man. Thanks a
Great.
lot.
No worries.
Cool, mate.